when I was performing and moved to Orlando, one of the great treats was to get to meet and know a little bit our next inductee. He is one of the links that kept the banjo alive during some very dark times, and his legacy continues. We're talking about someone you're going to meet. He had a wonderful, interesting story. Again, a lot of stuff to work with, so enjoy some interesting and really enlightening images from the career of Pat Terry Sr.
Although his was never a household name, the accomplishments made during the 60-year banjo-playing career of Pat Terry Sr. are made all the more significant when one considers that his star was rising exactly at the time that the banjo's popularity was fading into obscurity. Although the banjo and its music were considered out of date by the 1940s, Pat Terry's engaging and energetic stage presentations made the instrument not only acceptable, but enjoyable and exciting to the musically discriminating audiences in post-World War II America. As much as anyone, Pat Terry Sr. kept the banjo in the public eye during those dark days and added fuel to its fiery comeback during the nostalgia craze which swept the nation in the 1950s and 60s. Pat Terry was born Pat Theriault in 1917 in Van Buren, Maine. From the beginning, he was surrounded by music. His mother and father were both musicians, and their gift was passed to the Theriault children, each of whom played several instruments. More than his three brothers or sister, Pat was instinctively attracted to the percussive sound of the banjo, and quickly became a proficient tenor banjoist. His earliest performing experiences took place when he was 10 years old, playing with the Theriault family band at dances and on radio broadcasts in Connecticut. National shows premised on the discovery and encouragement of young or unknown talent have been a staple of the entertainment industry for decades. Long before the current phenomenon of American Idol, there were shows such as Arthur Godfrey's Talent Scouts and Ted Mack's original Amateur Hour. But the originator of the concept was a former patent medicine salesman turned broadcaster named Edward Bose. Known as Major Bose to millions of radio listeners, his weekly broadcast from New York's Capitol Theater provided not only good entertainment, but a chance at stardom to young hopefuls as well. With the encouragement of his mother, a new suit of clothes, and his banjo, Pat headed to New York City to audition for the Major Bose radio program. His audition impressed the show's talent scouts so much that even before he'd performed on the show, Bose purchased him a ticket on TWA Airlines to get him to Kansas City in time to appear at the Newman Theater the following day. Imagine the pride and excitement the young man felt as he rode home with that news. For the next several years, Terry crisscrossed the country, remaining one of the most popular performers with the Major Bose International Review. In 1939, Pat took a bride and settled down for a while in Southbridge, Massachusetts. While living there, the celebrity status achieved with the Major Bose Show allowed him to open a music studio in which he taught over 150 banjo students each week. He also formed a combo which played almost nightly in area nightclubs and dances. However, as content as his time in Southbridge was, the road was calling and another opportunity was on the horizon. Band leader Horace Heidt produced stage shows much like those of Major Bose, basically a talent competition in which the winner is allowed to continue with the show as long as he or she keeps winning. Pat Terry was a natural for Horace Heidt, and with the support of his wife drove to Hartford to try out for the show. Following a brief audition in which he played Tiger Rag with a banjo behind his head, Heidt told Pat, "Go home, pack up your stuff and quit your job. You're traveling with me." Pat met the troupe in Boston where he won the competition. He then traveled to Syracuse, New York and repeated the scene. Pat won so often and became so well known that the premise of a talent competition no longer worked. Horace Heidt signed Pat Terry to a contract which made him a permanent member of his touring shows. One of his first stops with Horace Heidt was Enid, Oklahoma, with the following night in Oklahoma City. This routine repeated itself over and over during the 4 years that followed until Pat Terry looked back and realized he'd performed in over 500 cities from coast to coast with the Horace Heidt Show. Immediately after leaving the Horace Heidt Revue, Pat joined another national touring show which starred accordionist Dick Contino, famous for his recording of Lady of Spain. Given Pat's spirited banjo performances and Contino's mastery of the accordion, it's hard to imagine a more entertaining and energetic stage combination. One of their first stops was Broadway's Capitol Theater in New York, where Pat's solo of Chinatown was an immediate sensation, earning him the nickname of Chinatown Pat. It was while on the road with the Contino show that Terry's banjo artistry was enlisted to be part of an all-star cast which included Frank Sinatra, Danny Kaye, Arthur Godfrey, and Gordon MacRae, all appearing in a single concert which was hosted by Bob Hope, certainly a career highlight for any performer. Even though his wife Rita had always supported his musical career, with a young family, the life of a touring musician is less than ideal, and in 1950 Pat again decided to settle down. Throughout the 1950s, he stayed fairly close to home, promoting his own solo shows and often performing with his brothers Emil and Larry as the Terry Brothers Trio. Their three-banjo routine was a sensation wherever they performed. In 1957, Pat appeared at the Gilded Cage, an 1890s theme club where, in addition to being the resident banjo player, he appeared in melodrama with the soon-to-be famous master of the malaprop, Norm Crosby. It was also in the late 1950s that Terry made his first-ever theme park appearance at a short-lived Massachusetts attraction called Pleasure Island. One day in 1959, the Three Stooges had been booked to do a stage show there. Prior to the show, Curly arrived with an armful of musical arrangements and asked the manager where the orchestra was. The manager pointed to Pat standing there alone with his banjo and said, "There's your orchestra." True professionals all around, the show went on to great audience response. One of the unforeseen benefits of staying home to help raise his family came in the mid-1950s when his son, Pat Terry Jr., developed an interest in the banjo. With youthful enthusiasm and one of the best banjo teachers in the world as a father, Pat Jr. progressed rapidly and soon was joining Dad as a guest during stage shows. While a true professional pairing of Pat Terry Sr. and Pat Terry Jr. was a couple years in the future, the elder Terry had another career highlight in store. In 1962, Walt Disney was producing a show scheduled to appear at New York's Radio City Music Hall entitled Disneyland USA. One of the planned highlights of the show called for a banjo soloist playing The World is Waiting for the Sunrise to be accompanied by the Rockettes, also playing banjos. Pat Terry's ability as both a banjo soloist and a banjo teacher to 50 long-legged chorus girls made him the perfect man for the job. The show and Pat's solo were a rousing success and marked the first of 4 extended engagements on the great stage at the legendary theater. Terry returned to Radio City Music Hall as a soloist in 1965. Then, in 1968, the duo of Pat Terry Sr. and Jr. performed in a show called Words and Music by Irving Berlin. Finally, in 1971, Pat Sr. and Pat Jr. took turns at solo spots in yet another new show entitled A Tribute to Stephen Foster. As a solo performer and teacher, Pat Sr. made the most of the 1960s nostalgia boom, which created a seemingly insatiable demand for banjo players. He performed at many Boston area nightclubs, including the Banjo Room and Katie's, and gave banjo lessons to Joel Schiavone, who went on to establish the Your Father's Mustache chain of nightclubs. As the 1960s progressed, an increasing number of Pat Terry banjo engagements were becoming Pat Terry and Son banjo engagements. The musical pair was increasingly inseparable. In addition to their highlight 1968 performance at Radio City, they performed at attractions such as Pleasure Island and Gaslight Village, as well as making memorable appearances on stage shows with Jimmy Durante and Ed Sullivan. While 1971 saw the duo appearing as a feature act at the Golden Horseshoe Theater at California's Disneyland, the greatest notoriety for Pat Terry and Son was yet to come. In fall of 1971, the entertainment industry was buzzing in anticipation of the opening of the Walt Disney World Resort in Orlando, Florida. The best of the nation's musicians and entertainers had been recruited by Disney to provide guests with an experience which was second to none. As part of that elite group, it was in this fertile music and entertainment environment that Pat Terry and Son made their most significant contributions to the banjo. Beginning on opening day, October 1st, 1971, and during the 10-year run that followed at Disney's Magic Kingdom, Pat Terry and Son performed for an estimated 126 million people, which included presidents, senators, ambassadors, and kings. As a banjo player historically never keeps any job long enough to retire from it, Pat Terry Sr. was in an almost unheard of position when he began to contemplate retirement in the early 1980s. But his decision was made, and following thousands of shows at Disney's Magic Kingdom and the appropriate tributes and testimonials from Disney management, friends, fellow musicians, and family, on May 27, 1982, Pat Terry Sr. officially retired. During his retirement years, Pat seemed happy to be out of the full-time banjo business, but satisfied an occasional desire to perform by joining Pat Jr. on special shows around Florida. The father and son shared a unique bond both on and off stage, which became more precious as years went by. Pat Sr. also enjoyed watching yet another generation of Terrys taking up the banjo. When Pat Terry Sr. passed away on July 3, 1997, after a career spanning 6 decades, he left behind not only memories, but a living legacy as well. Through his ongoing nightly appearances as a star performer at the Walt Disney World Resort, Pat Terry Jr. does honor to his father's memory by continuing the synonymous association of the name Pat Terry with everything representing quality in banjo music and entertainment.
Please welcome Pat Terry Sr.